So every argument has at least one premise, a conclusion, and support. We also discussed how types of argument, deductive arguments and inductive arguments, are different depending on the kind of support that they use. A deductive argument has been defined as an argument incorporating the claim that it is impossible that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. And the kind of support that a deductive argument uses is one in which the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being definitely true. Now, throughout Learning Module 1, we discussed arguments based on mathematics, arguments from definition, but we primarily focused on categorical syllogisms and arguments in propositional logic. All of these arguments are arguments that use deductive reasoning. In other words, they use the kind of reasoning in which it is the intent of the author that if all the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. This is what makes them deductive arguments, the type of reasoning that they employ. Now, we also discussed how to evaluate deductive arguments. Specifically focusing on categorical syllogisms and arguments in propositional logic, we discussed how there are three major things that we need to do when we evaluate any deductive argument. First, we do a truth-value analysis, and when we do a truth-value analysis, we determine whether the premises are actually true or false. Second, we do a logical analysis. In logical analysis, we determine whether the reasoning involved in the deductive argument is valid or invalid, whether or not the deductive argument has good deductive reasoning or bad deductive reasoning. Now remember, there is a difference between a deductive argument and a valid deductive argument. A deductive argument is one in which it is the intent of the author that if the premises were true, the conclusion would definitely follow. Or, in other words, it is the intent of the author that if the premises were true, it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. Or, it is the intent of the author that the premises provide definite support for the truth of the conclusion. However, a valid deductive argument is different from a deductive argument in that a valid deductive argument is one in which it is actually the case that this intent is fulfilled. So a valid deductive argument is one in which it is actually the case that the argument does indeed provide definite support for the conclusion. Or it is actually the case that if the premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. Or it is actually the case that if the premises were true, then the conclusion will also be true. Along with doing truth-value analysis and logical analysis, we also discussed how you would evaluate the argument as a whole. Now, when we're talking about the evaluation of the argument as a whole, we're bringing together both truth-value analysis and logical analysis to determine whether or not the argument as a whole is a good deductive argument or a bad deductive argument. We refer to good deductive arguments as sound arguments and bad deductive arguments as unsound arguments. And we also discussed how there's only one way in which you can have a sound deductive argument. You must have all premises being true, and you must have valid reasoning. However, there are several different ways in which you can have an unsound argument. You can have a deductive argument that has at least one premise that is false, which makes it unsound. However, it may also have valid good reasoning. Or you can have an unsound argument that has all true premises, but it is invalid in reasoning. Or you can have a deductive argument which fails in both truth-value analysis and logical analysis in that it has at least one premise that is false and invalid reasoning. Now, inductive arguments are different from deductive arguments because they use a different kind of reasoning. An inductive argument is an argument incorporating the claim that it is improbable that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. The key word here is improbability. The kind of reasoning that inductive arguments use is inductive reasoning. This is the kind of reasoning in which the intent of the author is that the premises provides support for the conclusion being probably true. Now here, notice the difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments. For deductive arguments, the kind of reasoning employed by the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being definitely true. Whereas for inductive arguments, the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being probably true. Now this is the main distinction or difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments. And all arguments can be separated in terms of deductive arguments or inductive arguments based on the kind of reasoning that they employ. Now the way in which you evaluate inductive arguments is very similar to the way in which you would evaluate a deductive argument. What I mean by this is that for inductive arguments, like deductive arguments, we do truth-value analysis, logical analysis, and we also evaluate the argument as a whole. Also, it is the case that, like deductive arguments, when we do truth-value analysis, we simply want to determine whether the premises are actually true or false. However, unlike evaluating deductive arguments, when we do logical analysis of inductive arguments, we're concerned here about the strength in support that the premises provide to the conclusion, what is also referred to as the degree of support. The reason for this is because for logical analysis, we're evaluating the reasoning of the argument involved. When we want to determine the degree of strength for inductive arguments, in other words, if we want to determine the quality of the reasoning in inductive arguments, what we want to know is whether or not the argument has strong or weak reasoning. An inductive argument has strong reasoning when, if the premises were true, the premises would provide probable support for the conclusion being true. In other words, when you want to determine whether or not an inductive argument has strong reasoning, you have to ask yourself, assuming that the premises are true, is it the case that the conclusion would probably be true? If the answer is yes, then the argument has strong reasoning. Weak reasoning refers to the type of reasoning in inductive arguments where even if the premises were true, those premises would not provide support for the conclusion being probably true. So, if you ask yourself, assuming that the premises are true, do they provide support for the conclusion probably being true? And the answer is no, then the argument is a weak argument. In other words, it has weak inductive reasoning. Now finally, like deductive arguments, we are going to bring together both truth-value analysis and logical analysis to evaluate the entire argument as a whole. For inductive arguments, unlike deductive arguments, what we're concerned with here is that of cogency. Now for deductive arguments, we are concerned with soundness. For inductive arguments, when we evaluate the argument as a whole, we want to know if the argument is cogent or uncogent. Now, these two terms are very similar to sound and unsound. However, the difference is that these two terms, cogent and uncogent, apply to good inductive arguments or bad inductive arguments, whereas sound and unsound respectively refer to good deductive arguments and bad deductive arguments. Now, like soundness, there's only one way in which an argument can be cogent. In other words, there's only one way in which you can have a good inductive argument as a whole. A good inductive argument must have all true premises and strong reasoning. On the other hand, similar to unsound arguments, uncogent arguments may be uncogent for various reasons. You can have an uncogent argument, which is a bad inductive argument, by either having an inductive argument with at least one false premise, but also has strong reasoning, or you can have an inductive argument with all true premises, but with weak reasoning, or you can have an inductive argument where it has at least one false premise and weak reasoning. In all three cases, you would have a bad inductive argument. So in all three cases, these would be uncogent arguments. There are several types of inductive arguments that we will be discussing. First of all, arguments based on signs, argument from authority, generalizations, also referred to as inductive generalizations, predictions, also referred to as predictive arguments, argument from analogy, also referred to as analogical arguments, statistical arguments, causal inference, also referred to as causal arguments, and informal fallacies. In this section, I'm going to go over the forms of these types of arguments. Now, there are some general things that you should know about inductive argument forms and their names before we go on to discuss the specific forms of inductive arguments. First, inductive argument forms, or also referred to as frameworks, are typical patterns of reasoning that inductive arguments may take. Now, this is very similar to deductive argument forms in that deductive argument forms are patterns of reasoning that deductive arguments can take. However, unlike deductive argument forms, inductive argument forms cannot always help you determine whether or not the argument has good or bad reasoning. The reason for this is because the quality of the reasoning for inductive arguments, unlike deductive arguments, depend on the content, what is actually stated in the premises and the conclusion, and not the structure or form of the argument. Recall that for deductive arguments, the form of the argument was able to tell us whether or not the argument was valid or invalid. For example, if you had a modus tollens, you knew that the argument would be valid, and if you had an argument that was denying the antecedent, you knew that the argument would be invalid. And this is just based on the form or the structure of the argument itself. However, for inductive arguments, this is not the case. The pattern of the argument or the form or structure will not help you determine whether or not the argument employs good reasoning. In order to determine whether or not the argument employs good reasoning, you're going to have to think about the content, what is stated in the actual premises and conclusion of the argument. Now, because the quality of the argument in terms of its reasoning, whether or not it has good reasoning or bad reasoning, cannot be determined by the form or the pattern of the argument, it's also the case that the names of inductive argument forms often, although not always, depend not only on the argument form but also the quality of reasoning employed by an argument. So sometimes you might have the same argument form, pattern of reasoning, which is associated with two different names depending on the quality of the reasoning. Now, this is very different also from deductive arguments. Remember, deductive arguments, a single form had its own name and no other name had the same form. But this is not going to be the case for inductive arguments. For inductive arguments, sometimes you will have a situation where two different names are attached to the same argument form. And what differentiates the different names is not the pattern of reasoning, but the quality of the reasoning, whether or not it's a weak argument or a strong argument. Furthermore, it's also the case that unlike deductive argument forms, a single inductive argument may follow more than one inductive form. Now remember, for deductive arguments, a single argument will only employ one type of form. So the major take-home lesson is that categories of inductive arguments are a lot messier than categories of deductive arguments. So don't assume that you're going to have inductive arguments that can be very easily categorized like you can with deductive arguments. You're going to have to think a little bit more about inductive arguments before you can determine the pattern or form that they employ and what type of argument they are, because unlike deductive arguments, categorizing inductive arguments is not as straightforward. Argument based on sign is the first inductive argument form that we'll be discussing. Any argument based on sign has the following pattern of reasoning. One of its premises, or at least one of its premises, will cite or observe a sign. And what we mean by a sign is basically any kind of sign or symbol. There is a stop sign at the intersection, so I should probably stop at this intersection. Now, the premise of this argument is there is a stop sign at this intersection. Notice that this premise cites a sign. The conclusion is I should probably stop at this intersection. Notice that the conclusion asserts something about the thing or situation that the sign symbolizes. In this case, that one should stop at this intersection. Now, this argument is actually a strong argument based on sign. The reason for that is because if the premises were true, it actually supports the probability of the conclusion being true. Whenever it's the case that you see a stop sign at an intersection, it's most likely the case that you should probably stop. Now compare this argument with the following example. There is a stop sign in your room, so I should probably stop in your room. Now this has the same pattern of reasoning going on as the first argument, which is why they're both argument based on signs. The premise is there is a stop sign in your room, and notice how the premise cites a sign. The conclusion is, I should probably stop in your room. Now notice how the conclusion asserts something about the thing or situation that the sign symbolizes. However, in this case, you have actually a weak inductive argument. The reason for that is because even if the premises were true, it would not support the probable truth of the conclusion. Even if it's true that there's a stop sign in your room, this probably doesn't mean that one should stop in your room. It's most likely the case that you have a stop sign in your room because you have it for aesthetic reasons or some other reason, rather than telling someone to stop in your room. Now for both of these arguments, the strong argument based on sign and the weak argument based on sign, the name of the argument actually doesn't change based on the quality of its reasoning. So both the strong argument based on sign and the weak argument based on sign are referred to as arguments based on sign. So we would indicate the difference between the strong and the weak one by noting the quality of the reasoning in the name. We refer to the strong argument based on sign as the strong argument based on sign, and the weak argument based on sign as the weak argument based on sign. Our next inductive argument is the argument from authority. An argument from authority will have at least one premise or more than one premise that cites that some person or source stated something X. Now, X could be any kind of proposition that the person or source has stated. The conclusion asserts that this proposition X is probably true, or that some statement Y, which follows from the proposition X, is probably true. Now, here is an example of an argument from authority. According to Stephen Hawking, there's a high statistical probability that intelligent beings exist on some other planet in the universe. So, intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe. Now notice how in this argument the premise is that according to Stephen Hawking there is a high statistical probability that intelligent beings exist on some other planet in the universe. What this premise does is that it cites that some person or source stated something X. X being that there is a high statistical probability that intelligent beings exist on some other planet in the universe. The conclusion is that intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe. Now this asserts that the proposition X is probably true, or that some statement Y which follows from X is probably true. In this case, this conclusion is asserting that some proposition X, that intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet, is probably true. Now, what's going on in this argument is that the support that the premises provide to the conclusion depend on the reliability of the source that's being cited. Because Stephen Hawking is a very well-known mathematician and also scientist, he actually would be a good, reliable source about the statistical probability of intelligent life existing in other planets in the universe. So this would be considered a strong argument. Now, some of you might disagree with the strength of this argument. You might say that, well, although there is some reason to think that what Stephen Hawking said is true, it's not strong, it's more so moderate. And this is actually a fine conclusion for you to draw, because for inductive arguments, it's actually the case that you have various degrees of support ranging from strong to weak and even 0 degrees of support. So you can have degrees of support in between strong and weak. However, in this course and according to your text, we will only use the values of strong and weak. So, although you might say that the degree of support that the premises provide to the conclusion in this example is more so moderate, we'll consider it a strong argument because we're only going to be using those values of strong and weak to describe the quality of reasoning of inductive arguments. So if you think that an argument has reasoning that could be moderate to weak, then consider that argument to have weak reasoning. And if you consider an argument to have moderate to strong reasoning, then consider that argument to have strong reasoning. Now notice here how the strong argument from authority is referred to simply as the argument from authority. We don't have to indicate here that the argument is a strong argument from authority. The reason for this is because, as you will see in the next slide, weak arguments from authority have a different name. Here is an example of an inductive argument from authority in which the reasoning is definitely weak. The argument reads, "My drunk Aunt Jenny said she saw an alien spaceship the other night, so intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe." Notice that this argument actually has the same form or pattern of reasoning as the other argument from authority. The premise is that my drunk Aunt Jenny said she saw an alien spaceship the other night. Notice that this premise cites that some person or source stated something X. The statement X is that she saw an alien spaceship the other night. Now the conclusion is that intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe. Now notice how this conclusion asserts that X is probably true, or that some statement Y, which follows from X, is probably true. In this case, an inference is being made from the proposition X, that my drunk Aunt Jenny saw an alien spaceship the other night, to what is being stated in the conclusion, which is that intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe. So in this case, you have an assertion that some statement Y, which follows from another statement X, which is being cited in the premises, is probably true. This is a weak argument from authority, and the reason for that is because even if the premises were true, those premises would not provide enough support to think that the conclusion is probably true. The fact that my drunk Aunt Jenny said she saw an alien spaceship the other night does not give very much support to the probability of it being true that intelligent beings probably exist on some other planet in the universe. The reason for this is because my drunk Aunt Jenny is probably not a very reliable source. Now, notice how this argument is a weak argument from authority. And because it's a weak argument from authority, it actually has a different name. We refer to weak arguments from authority as appeal to unqualified authority or appeals to inappropriate authority. So, anytime you have an argument from authority that is actually a weak argument, you would refer to that argument not as an argument from authority, but as an appeal to unqualified authority or an appeal to inappropriate authority. Next, we have the inductive generalization, also referred to as generalizations. For inductive generalizations, you'll have the premise or premises observe something about a sample of a particular group or class. Then the conclusion asserts that what has been observed of the sample can be applied to the entire group or class as a whole. Here is an example of an inductive generalization. More than 250,000 pregnant seals have been observed so far, and they all have been found to give live births. So all pregnant seals probably give live births. Notice how what this does is, in the premises, there is an observation of a sample of a particular group or class that is being made. Specifically in the second premise, which states that they, the observed pregnant females, all have been found to give live births. Notice that what this statement is doing is citing an observation of a sample of a particular group or class. In this case, that group or class is pregnant female seals. And the characteristic that's being observed is that they give live births. Finally, in the conclusion, you have the assertion that what has been observed of the sample in the premises applies to the entire group or class as a whole. Here the conclusion states all pregnant seals probably give live birth. Notice how in this argument what we're doing is we're going from characteristics observed of a sample of a class or group to, in the conclusion, applying that characteristic to the entire class or group itself. This example here is a strong argument. The reason for that is because seeing more than 250,000 pregnant seals giving live birth actually gives us pretty good evidence to think that the conclusion is probably true, that all pregnant seals probably give live births. As a strong argument of this kind, we simply refer to it as an inductive generalization. Notice how in the name of this argument, we don't actually cite the strength or quality of reasoning of the argument. We don't call it a strong inductive generalization, we simply call it an inductive generalization. The reason for this, like the argument from authority, is because weak versions of this type of argument actually have a different name, and we'll see this on the following slide. Here's another example of an inductive generalization. I know 5 accountants and they are all crazy, so all accountants are probably crazy. Now notice how this argument has the same form as the previous argument that we've just discussed. It has a premise that makes an observation of a sample of a particular group or class, and then it asserts in its conclusion that what has been observed of the sample applies to the entire group or class as a whole. Specifically, premise 2 is what makes the observation of a sample of a particular group or class. In this case, it observes that the 5 accountants that I know are all crazy. Then, in the conclusion, the assertion is made about the entire class of accountants, specifically that they're probably crazy. Now, notice how in this argument you actually have a very weak argument in terms of the degree or quality of strength in the argument. The premises that 5 accountants I know are all crazy actually does not support the probable truth of the conclusion that all accountants are probably crazy. Part of this is because the sample size here in this argument, 5 accountants, is way too small to support this kind of generalization. In this case, because it is a weak inductive generalization, we actually refer to this argument as a hasty generalization. So hasty generalization refers to weak versions of inductive generalizations, and the term inductive generalization refers to strong versions of this type of argument. Our next inductive argument form is the predictive argument. For a predictive argument, you have premises or a premise that cites past observations, and then the conclusion asserts a prediction about the future based on the past observations cited. Here is an example of a predictive argument. Every time a ball has been dropped, the ball has fallen toward the ground. So if I drop a ball, then it will probably fall toward the ground. Notice that the premise cites past observations. The premise states every time a ball has been dropped, the ball has fallen toward the ground. Then notice how the conclusion asserts a prediction about the future based on the past observations. If I drop a ball, then it will probably fall towards the ground. This is referred to as a predictive argument specifically because the conclusion of this argument makes a prediction. This is the key defining feature of a predictive argument. Now this argument is actually a very strong argument. The reason for this is because the past instances that have been cited actually support the probability of the conclusion being true. So this is referred to as a strong predictive argument. Weak versions of predictive arguments are not given a different name. They are simply considered weak predictive arguments. So for predictive arguments, you don't have 2 different argument names that refer to the same argument form in which the different names depend on the quality of the reasoning. Here is an example of a predictive argument that is actually a weak predictive argument. Last time I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table and I won $200. So if I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table again, I will win $200. Notice how this argument actually has the same form or pattern of reasoning as the inductive argument previously discussed. You have here a premise that cites past observations. In this case, the premise states, last time I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table, I won $200. Then the conclusion asserts a prediction about the future based on the past observations. If I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table again, I will win $200. Now in this case, the premises do not actually support the probable truth of the conclusion. Simply because you bet on 29 red at the blackjack table in the past and you won $200 does not give you good reasons to believe that betting on 29 red at the blackjack table again will have you win $200. So in this case, you actually have a weak predictive argument. The name of the predictive argument does not change depending on the quality of the reasoning employed by that argument. So a strong predictive argument is referred to as a strong predictive argument, and a weak predictive argument is referred to as a weak predictive argument. Next, we have analogical arguments. Analogical arguments will be a type of argument that we'll focus on in this lesson. Although inductive arguments may have a number of premises, what's cited in these argument forms are those premises that are very important to the reasoning that makes the argument the type of argument that it is. So an analogical argument might have more than two premises, but there are two premises that are very important to the type of argument that an analogical argument is. One of the premises is that it observes that two things, x and y, have similar characteristics or qualities, a, b, c, etc. You would have two things being compared here, notice, in terms of having similar characteristics. And you can actually have more than one number of characteristics or qualities that are being cited for both the things being compared. The other premise observes that one of the things x has another characteristic or quality y. So in the other premise, I will call this the second premise, the argument observes that one of the things being compared in the first premise has some other characteristic that has not been mentioned in the first premise. Then in the conclusion asserts that the other thing y probably has the other characteristic or quality k as well based on the similarities observed in the premises. So what the conclusion is doing is applying the characteristic that's being mentioned or observed of one thing to the other thing that's being observed. Here is an example of an analogical argument. Joey can produce really great oil paintings of landscapes. So since painting with acrylic paints rely on similar brush skills and techniques, Joey can probably produce really great acrylic paintings. Notice the two premises in this argument. The first premise, painting with acrylic paints rely on similar brush skills and techniques compared to painting with oil paints, observes that two things, x and y, painting with acrylic paints is x and painting with oil paints is y, have similar characteristics or quality, in this case, rely on similar brush skills and techniques. Then the second premise observes that one of the things x has another characteristic or quality. In this case, you have the observation that Joey can produce really great oil paintings of landscapes. So here you have the observation that oil paintings of landscapes are things that Joey can produce really well. The conclusion then asserts that the other thing y probably has the other characteristic or quality k as well based on the similarities observed in the premises. In this case, you have the conclusion Joey can probably produce really great acrylic paintings. So notice how the property or quality or characteristic that Joey can probably produce really great paintings of some type is being applied to acrylic paintings in the conclusion. Now this argument is a moderate to strong argument. If the premises were true, it would support the probable truth of the conclusion. If it's true that oil paints and acrylic paints actually rely on similar brush skills and techniques, then given this similarity, as well as the fact that Joey can produce really great oil paintings, should give us good reasons to think that Joey can also produce really great acrylic paintings. So this is a strong argument, and we will refer to this type of argument as a strong analogical argument. Notice that the name of the argument actually includes the quality or strength of the reasoning involved. So in this case, analogical arguments do not actually differ much in name based on the quality or reasoning of this argument. So a strong analogical argument will simply be referred to as a strong analogical argument. Here is an example of a weak analogical argument, which is sometimes referred to as a weak analogy or a false analogy. The argument reads, Joey can produce really great oil paintings of landscapes. So since oil painting and marble sculpting are both forms of art, Joey can probably produce really great marble landscape sculptures. Now notice how this argument actually has the same form or structure or pattern of reasoning as the previous argument. You have here in the premises two premises, one in which you have the observation that two things, x and y, have similar characteristics or qualities. In this case, the premise 1 makes this observation that oil painting and marble sculpting are both forms of art. And then you have the second premise, Joey can produce really great oil paintings of landscapes, which makes the observation that one of the things X has another characteristic or quality K. Here in this case, you have the observation that oil paintings has the quality or characteristic of Joey being able to produce really great ones. Then finally, in the conclusion, you have the assertion that the other thing Y probably has the other characteristic or quality K as well, based on the similarities observed in the premises. So the conclusion states that Joey can probably produce really great marble landscape sculptures. Now, this argument is actually a very weak argument, and the reason for that is because even if the premises were true, those premises would not support the probability of the conclusion being true. So this is a weak argument. Now, because this is a weak argument, we refer to it as a weak analogy or a false analogy, but we can also just simply refer to this as a weak analogical argument. As I've mentioned, we will look at analyzing and evaluating analogical arguments in detail in the second part of Lesson 7. Next, we have statistical arguments. Statistical arguments have two important premises as well, just like analogical arguments and a conclusion. Now, although there are two important premises that help identify statistical arguments as statistical arguments, a statistical argument may actually have more than these two premises. What you need to make sure to do is actually focus on finding the two premises that are important to the actual structure or framework of this argument. This will actually be the case for any inductive argument. So when you're analyzing inductive arguments, what you want to do is look for key premises or key conclusions which help indicate what type of argument the argument you have is. One of the premises of a statistical argument observes that a sample or a percentage of a group or class X has some characteristic or qualities A, B, or C. Then the next premise asserts that some particular thing Y belongs in the group or class X mentioned in the premises. Finally, the conclusion asserts that a particular thing Y probably has characteristic or qualities A, B, C mentioned in the premises. Now, a statistical argument may be similar to an inductive generalization in that both of these types of arguments will have a premise that asserts that a sample or a percentage of a group or class X has some characteristic or qualities A, B, C. However, note that inductive generalizations are different from statistical arguments in the sense that they have different second premises. For statistical arguments, the second premise asserts that some particular thing Y belongs in the same group or class X mentioned in the premises. This is not going to be the case with inductive generalizations. Furthermore, what is going on in the conclusion is also different in a statistical argument. In a statistical argument, it is asserted that the particular thing Y probably also has the characteristic or qualities A, B, C mentioned in the premises. This is not going to be the case with inductive generalizations. Now let's look at an example here of a statistical argument. 90% of a random sample of Clemson students love logic. Gretchen is a Clemson student, so Gretchen probably loves logic. Notice that what this argument does in its premises are two things. The first premise, 90% of a random sample of Clemson students love logic, observes that a sample or percentage of a group or class X has some characteristic or qualities Y. In this case, we're talking about the group or class of Clemson students having the characteristic of loving logic. Then the second premise asserts that some particular thing Y, in this case Gretchen, belongs in the group or class X, in this case the class of Clemson students, which is mentioned